Hi, this is Keith at Custom Works. Today we're going to go over installation of our 2G subframe connectors and a little overview on their design and how they're installed and how they function. So what we got here is a pair of our 2G 3-point subframe connectors, and generally these things we intended them to be welded in, but we also have provisions in them to be bolted in. And we'll go over that a little bit more as we're installing these things. But the reason why we call them our 3-point subframe connectors is you've got the front half where they bolt up to the actual rear part of the subframe of the car. And then you've got this other mounting point here, about a foot behind the front mounting point, that's actually going to going to bolt up into a cross member into the vehicle. And then you've got the rear part that wraps around the frame rail, and you can see there's provisions in there for bolts, and we'll talk about that again a little bit down the line. One of the nice attributes of our subframe connectors is weight. These things are designed to not be any heavier than they need to be. One of the things that we were able to do was use a thinner wall tubing, and rather than bending them, we actually pie cut them, and then we TIG weld them back together to get the angle that we need. Square tubing doesn't bend very well, and it deforms when you bend it, which can actually reduce its strength. So we've kind of found a good balance between weight and strength on these things, to not really add any unnecessary strength to them. We also gusset the front portion of our connector here, rear portion. One thing you will notice on ours, we don't use a plastic cap on the rear of our subframe connector. The rear mount is fully welded. And also included with your subframe connectors is going to be instruction and the bolts for the midpoint mount. Okay, so we're preparing the subframe connector to be installed onto the car. One of the things that'll help you install it is a clamp like this, and maybe something to support the rear part of it. Some of the things that are going to need to be removed and remounted after the subframes are connected. You've got a line here that holds your return line, a bracket in place. At the rear, you've also got the same line. It's going to need to be pulled away. This particular car, we're running new lines on it on the driver's side, so those also will need to be pulled away and then reattached in a little bit different manner after you've got them installed. So step one is going to be to actually just fit the subframe connector up into the car. So we've gone ahead and placed the subframe connector in its location, and we've marked around the front and the rear brackets. And we're gonna go ahead and remove the paint from the edges of the subframe connector as well as the frame, and we're gonna get these prepped and ready to weld in. Okay, so we've got the subframe connector back in place, and we've prepped the frame as well as the edges of the subframe connector. You can see here we've removed the powder coating where we intend to weld this thing. You can also see we've got our solid body bushings in place. If you've never seen those installed, here's what they look like. And we've also done the same in the rear, prepped it, ready to go. So what we're working on right now is our 3rd point connection here. You can see it on both sides of the frame. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna mount into this cross member in the floor pan, which is pretty heavy gauge steel. We're gonna drill 1/4-inch holes for the self-tapping bolts. Okay, so now we've got the self-tapping bolts into the cross member here on the midpoint of the subframe connector. And as you can see, we've just used washers here to kind of take up the gap. And really what you're looking for is for the front of the frame connector to be slightly above the bottom edge of the subframe, so you've got some material here to weld. And also right here on the seat pan of the car, as you can see here, it's almost touching, but it's not. There's probably about an 1/8 inch or so plus gap there. So that's pretty optimal. So if it was touching the floor, probably wouldn't be a big issue, but it potentially could cause kind of a rattling sound. So that's what you're looking for, is a slight gap. You want these things to be tucked up as high as possible. Okay, so we've got the front of the frame connector welded in place, and as you noticed, we've basically got a bead weld here and here. If you want, you can do plug welds where we've got the holes for if you wanted to bolt them. And also, if you wanted to bolt them, what we'd suggest doing is actually using a 3/8 bolt, and instead of using a bolt and clamping it all the way through, we'd basically recommend using 4 individual bolts and nuts and bolting each side independently. That way you're not crushing the frame. Again, here's our midpoint mounting points installed. And also at the rear, what we'd suggest doing is using a 3/8 bolt, similar to the 5/16 bolts that we used at the midpoint, using those self-tapping sheet metal type bolts into the frame rails. The biggest issue with bolting the rear frame rail is it's not very thick metal, and these change on different years. I think the earlier cars, the frames were a little thinner than the later cars, and you can see this car is not the prettiest car underneath, but pretty typical of what we see. And also, you know, when you're welding, keep in mind that you're welding to fairly thin sheet metal and not to burn it through. Welding is always going to be the better method of attaching these things. Also, one thing I wanted to point out was, as you're installing these, the subframe connector bracket back here is tapered. The frame's also tapered. So what you're most likely gonna do is you're actually gonna run the subframe connector all the way forward until it's tight. If your frame, then we've noticed the frame thickness back here varies from year to year, and actually just car to car mostly. You know, you can actually take this bracket and bend these ears in to make sure that you do have a tight fit. You know, whether you're welding or bolting, you're definitely going to want a tight fit on there for sure. Okay, quick tip. We get a lot of questions on people saying, hey, well, I want to install my subframe connectors. How do I know when the subframe's in correctly? Well, you can go to sites like Nasty Z28, and they'll provide you with some information on how to cross measure your car to make sure that it's straight and the frame's straight. But one of the things that we actually do is we'll actually take the subframe and we'll actually measure at different points side to side from the pinch weld underneath the rocker to the frame. And we'll measure that at the front and we'll measure that at the back. And what we can do is we can compare those measurements right to left and from the front of the subframe to the back of the subframe. And that's gonna give us a good idea if the thing's in straight or not. And again, always replace your body bushings before you put subframe connectors in. And we definitely recommend using solid body bushings rather than any type of polyurethane or rubber bushing. And again, a lot of times people ask us, you know, hey, is this gonna add noise to my car? And from our experience, what we found is it doesn't actually add noise to the vehicle. Generally speaking, it actually tightens everything up. Your doors won't rattle, the car won't squeak as much, and definitely doesn't add any, you know, any harshness to the ride. So while we got this car up on the lift, kind of give you an idea of how our subframe connectors look when installed. As you can see, you know, they don't really hang much lower than the bottom of the car. In most cases, they're pretty much even with, you know, your mufflers, maybe even slightly higher than your mufflers. We can walk you over here to my car, give you an idea. You can't even see the mufflers on the car, really. They actually hang just about maybe 3/4 of an inch lower than the subframe connectors. They really aren't very visible from underneath the car, which I think is nice. Hi, this is Keith again from Custom Works. Thanks again for watching this video, and if you'd like to see any other videos about our products, please let us know, and thanks for watching.